is the Russian pushes around Bakhmut. Did I say that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Um,
It's odd because I'm hearing, various different. It seems from what I'm seeing that it's extremely attritional on
it's
their part, but
weird.
it's also taking an immense toll on the Ukrainian forces as well.
It's
Um,
so like last time we talked about what we thought this was going to look like in the winter. And
yeah,
I kind of got into that I thought Russia was going to play for time and try to pause operations, and that Ukraine was going to try and push because
yeah,
that sort of made sense. So we are in kind of a weird spot weather-wise. Um, right now, like I said, you've been watching it obviously because you get the app because you used to live there, and I've been watching it just as a matter of curiosity. The weather in Ukraine has been exceedingly wet, and it's been creating a
yeah.
lot of muddy conditions, and that has stalled a lot of offensive operations.
Of
But
course.
every day I go and I check, and every day Russia's making these same 4 or 5 pushes and these same artillery strikes, and they're not
Yeah.
gaining ground. And there just seems like they're expending men. And I kind of got into this. I was watching Niels Puck Anders, uh, YouTuber, military analyst from Holland, not Holland, Netherlands. Um, and he was talking about whether or not Russia wants to be in a long war or a short war. And I kind of got the impression earlier when we talked about this in October that Russia was going to aim to drag this out.
Yeah.
But they're not doing the things that make sense if you want to drag it out. They're expending an awful lot of manpower to take
Just
someplace
because,
like.
so here's something that you got to take into consideration is just because they're not doing those things doesn't mean that they're not the objectives. And I think, in regard to, Russian um, military operations, from what we've seen, is a lot of things aren't going as planned, or they're doing things that are maybe they see some sort of logic in them that both of us miss, that most other people are missing, but that aren't necessarily what you know you would think would be necessary for prolonging this war or reconsolidating their forces. I think too, though, a lot of the media that you're seeing, you know, what we see of it isn't the exact situation on the ground. I think they're making incremental gains. It's very possible that they could take Bakhmut maybe in the next few weeks, completely encircle it. But, they've lost. One thing that is very clear is they've, paid a high price for it.
But what do they
Um,
get
how
strategically
high?
for Bakhmut is my question.
So, from what I understand, and please bear with me, I mean, in regards to the audience, because, you know, I've been all over the place in terms of following this conflict, and I'm not actually keeping as close of track as the military situation as I should be, and I'm not a military historian, but as far as I understand, there's a key road going through Bakhmut, and from there, once they take that, their goal is to advance into um, Slavyansk and I think Kramatorsk.
Which Ukraine can just fall back and defend those
I
towns
might
as
have that
tenaciously.
wrong.
I know I
So
get.
yeah, that's a lot. That's what a lot of other people are saying, but that's their logic, allegedly. Um,
it reminds
Also,
me.
cutting off that chain of that supply line, I guess, is important for them. But I don't know how consequential that is for Ukraine as a whole, because you know, Ukraine has an inherent advantage with logistics, because they're operating within their own territory, and most of it is not under Russian fire. And they're actually, as far as I can see, they're not really using their artillery to interdict um, supply lines as much as they probably should be. I'm talking about the Russian forces. Um, so yeah, I'm really kind of puzzled as well. the significance over Bakhmut. I'm also, I know that obviously they paid a price, but the question is how high has this price of attrition for this city, the fighting around it, how high has it been? And also the question which none of us can answer, not even the very respected military analysts, people who are
Who are
doing
not me.
advising. Uh, yeah, not us. um, Not me. Like as far as military history as well. But not even they know the extent to which the how this has affected Ukraine's force structure, how many casualties they've been taking, and how this could degrade them over time. So no one really knows that because Ukraine has has kept a very has kept this secret, very very I think competently so. So um yeah, that's the big question too, is and it's the question that I always have on my mind too, is how long will this go, and what is Ukraine and the West, with the West supplying Ukraine, realistically capable of? And I think that's a big unknown for for all of us right now.
Well, so I think it might be helpful to kind of establish what I think everyone's priorities should be. Um, I'm going to bring up the map and put it over our faces because I like the
Sounds
map.
good.
Um, so one of the things I think is kind of important to point out is that Ukraine needs to shorten, or not shorten, it needs to make the front line longer. Because when Kherson was retake, Russia retreats back across the river. The river kind of acts as a natural dampener to any attack that Ukraine wants to make
Of course.
across it. So it kind of shortens their options to maneuver and choose where to fight. So they want to try to get across that river. And I think Russia agrees because Russia has been building fortifications running from the river back to Crimea. So,
Any river crossing is going to be very difficult for them to achieve, and I think um,
well, the rivers have been.
especially for
Sorry, go.
no, you go ahead.
The rivers have been being used by Ukraine to great effect in holding Russia at bay, but now that
Mhm.
Ukraine is counterattacking and on the offensive, the same is going to hold true in the other direction.
One of the most bloody campaigns of the Second World War was the Dnipro offensive by the Soviet army. And this was after Germany had pulled back to the right bank of Ukraine. And
We're talking about the same river
that
right now.
actually, I think, as far as overall casualties, was maybe the highest in the entire Second World War for Soviet forces. It was literally just a game of pushing. They actually call it in Ukrainian "forsowanie na Dniepro." So like the forcing of the
At the
Dniepro,
Dnipro
and
River?
there's sort of there's a lot of I don't know if you've ever heard of like the black companies or black
Yeah.
battalions. So yeah, essentially these were young men uh, from the villages, in various places of Ukraine that the Red Army hastily mobilized. There's been a lot of I think there's a lot of like nationalist myths and misconceptions about it. I know it did happen, and I know that there were heavy casualties among them, and I know that it was done very haphazardly
Russia
and very
haphazardly mobilized people? Never happened.
yeah, of course, but there's a lot of Ukrainians sort of view this as sort of a punishment that was put upon them for the men that had stayed behind, or because in Soviet times, just staying in occupied territory was mm, they never really prosecuted it, but it was considered to be a crime. So when for example, when I was doing my own work on the Nazi occupation of Ukraine, one of the first things that a guilty person, so collaborator of some sort, will say, I admit that I'm guilty for staying on occupied territory instead of evacuating with the front or evacuating with, civilians. Um, so some Ukrainian historians have viewed this as a means to get rid of, the male population. But what I see it as, you know, I'm looking at it essentially from a military standpoint as well. I think it was a military decision. It was very poorly thought out and hastily done. And as we know, the Soviet army doctrine doesn't really care about lives. And they were throwing them essentially at one of the most difficult obstacles in all of history, to cross the Dnipro. And it was probably at the time one of the most well defended areas. So yeah, that's what we're looking at currently for Ukrainian forces in Chersonsk Oblast. So I don't know. I think that they could think of something, ingenious. Um, the one thing that has really amazed me so far is the ingenuity of the Ukrainian armed forces, and also their high command has been pretty crafty and skilled. But I don't know how they're gonna pull it off. I hope it's they come up with something spectacular, but everything that I know about military operations, which isn't a whole lot, tells me that any crossing of the river is going to be it's going to be a bloodbath. It's going to be very difficult.
So,
So
a river crossing kind of works similar in principle to a linear danger area. Uh, so, what a linear danger area is it's any area of open terrain that you have to cross as an infantry formation that leaves you exposed for extended periods of time. So, the classic example that you're taught as an infantryman is something like a road. And you cross this by posting people on both sides of the thing. So there's a very, very dangerous set at the beginning and the end, a very dangerous set of time at the beginning and the end where I have to do something about that too, where you are moving security elements for the left and the right side of the road crossing, for example, in place. This is complicated by the fact that water is not easy to cross as a road. Um, so what you do is you put post security on one end, troops that have to hold open this bridgehead, and then you post security on the back end, and then you move the rest of the formation through as efficiently and safely as possible. It takes a long time. For a river crossing, it's either you do it at a bridge or a pontoon bridge, or you do something like you run a rope across the river and you pull boats across. So it takes time. To that end, I have heard a couple reports that there are Ukrainian special forces operating on the Russian side of the river. So they could be setting conditions to go in and create that crossing at a later date. I don't think you're going to see any movement from Ukraine of significance anywhere, whether it's in the Kharkiv area, around Bakhmut, or by Kherson, till January when the ground freezes,
yeah, I would agree with you there.
because the
The one
weather's
thing,
just too bad.
the one thing I wanted to interject in regard to river crossings, or landings in general. Um, I've looked. I mean, I haven't looked extensively, but I've looked at some of the satellite photos of Russian, trenches, sort of their defense lines on the left bank of the river, and I mean they're pretty formidable. Um, so Ukraine, at least at this point, probably couldn't pull off something similar to what the Egyptians did, for example, when they crossed the uh, what's the name of the canal?
Suez?
Yeah, the Suez Canal in 1973. I think their main advantage there was, one, they attacked, the Israelis thought that any breach of the canal, any crossing, that they'd be able to counter the Egyptians with their air power and armor, if I understand it correctly. And they
That's
weren't able
about
to do
right.
this because of the Egyptians had set up a very formidable SAM umbrella, and also they had state of the art at the time technology, which was I think it was the AT-3 Sager in the NATO terminology. I forget actually what it's called in Russian. Um, but they use these anti-tank teams to really, really good effect. But also it was timing. So I don't see like a certain holiday where all Russians they move a bunch of their troops further inland, or let them take leave.
Well,
What happened
that kind of comes down to what I was talking about Ukraine needing to lengthen the front line, to lengthen their
Yeah,
possible attack options. Because I think one of the things that made that Kharkiv offensive so successful back in September was kind of the left hand going, we're going to hit Kherson, we're going to hit Kherson, we're going to hit Kherson, pop, Kharkiv. They telegraphed that attack. And it
yeah.
was a good telegraph because, like, a lot of people sat, looked at the map, and independently, like, I came up with, like, Ukraine's going to attack Kherson. It makes the most sense. A couple, like, in July, I was saying that. And then they go around in September and they start doing it. And then all of a sudden, this attack opens up in Kharkiv and everyone's shocked. I'm like, that's a really good use
What
of.
complicates this whole thing though is mobilization, and in our media we hear a lot about the high attrition rate in the mobilized forces, but what they've been doing is consolidating their lines. The Russians have been doing this,
For the
and
most part.
that creates a problem because the one advantage that they had in the Kharkiv operation is they were able to move some of their best units, the Ukrainians I'm talking about, and they were able to achieve a advantage numerically of about, I think it was something like 10-1. Numbers weren't deterministic in that, even though the Russian forces were woefully, I mean, spread thin in the Kharkiv region, but even so, they planned it very well. One, in terms of psyops, so they were broadcasting that they were going to hit Kherson, and then they have this other operation. But to me, what is interesting is you have these reports of Russian intelligence, of, like, the people on the ground, that they're noticing a buildup in that region and not no one did anything. So that's just another incompetent mistake, I think, on the part of Russian forces.
Well,
Um,
that was also the operation that prompted Russia to finally pick an overall commander for Ukraine. Um,
yeah,
it,
sort of.
the quality of that commander and is probably dubious. His name escapes me, but I know he was in charge of the Russian Air Force before, and he was in charge of the creation of a military police to deal with hazing and discipline issues. And since Russia has seriously lacked discipline and air support going forward, um, I'm not sure how good this guy actually is at his job. Uh, but that again comes down to that ability. They had that ability back in September where they could say, we're going to attack Kherson. Russia concentrates in Kherson, and it leaves all these other areas of the front unguarded effectively. And that's why I say open up the front, try to get more space. And really, the only place you can do that is cross the river in Kherson. Anywhere
Well,
else they attack would shorten the front.
I mean, a lot of people, and even myself included, they're talking about the axis toward Melitopol, so the Zaporizhia front line.
Yes.
But the issue is that Russian forces have reinforced that area as well. To what degree, I don't know. I haven't been following it enough. I've had this hope because I have people I care about in Melitopol that they'll be able to push down that way and cut Russian forces in half. But so far from all of the professional people I follow, it seems that in their estimates that Russia has reinforced that area, and they've actually been doing so since the summer.
Well,
But who knows? I mean, I'm hoping that they'll find a breakthrough somewhere. More likely, I think it's going to be a battle of attrition, and I think it's a battle. It's hard to say who has the advantage. Obviously, Russia has a manpower advantage, but you know, Ukraine is also fighting on its own territory. What do
what
you think? As far as so by attrition too, I want to clarify. I mean something similar to what we saw in Kherson. So gradual, incremental advancements by Ukrainian forces until finally it's untenable for the Russians, and then they pull back after suffering numerous casualties.
there is an impression that we have, especially living in the last 20 years, that warfare is going to be fast moving all the time.
Hmm.
Desert Storm, so I guess 30 years is probably a better way to put it. Desert Storm kind of inculcated on us this idea of a very quick war. I do not think, in most cases, that should necessarily be the assumption. Russia's invasion of Ukraine looks to me to be a lot more like something more akin to World War One, where you have trenches and you have men manning those trenches. So the first thing I would say about it is a trench and a fortification is only as good and as motivated as the men in it. Otherwise, all you got is a fancy hole in the ground. Um,
Yeah, that's another factor that I'm considering is
so
how much
how
training have the mobilized personnel, how much have they gotten? I know that actually, we heard some stories at the beginning of mobilization of them being thrown at the front without, any sort of training and very little in terms of equipment and supplies. But, now we're seeing, you know, something different. But I don't think that the quality of these troops is substantially any better. And the problem, as we know, is that Russia's lost a lot of its best, most elite units. They've suffered heavy attrition. So, as far as going forward, how these mobilized personnel will be able to, uh, sort of withstand Ukrainian assaults. I mean, that's an unknown. So we don't know what's going to happen with that.
yeah, and again, it's
Uh,
going to be really hard to see what happens about that till January, February when the ground
yeah,
freezes
yeah,
and
until everything freezes.
big offensive operations on either side resume. The other thing I would point out is the problem that Ukraine in the spring and the fall presents is mud, which complicates operations. It limits where you can go, especially if you're Russia and haven't been maintaining your equipment, which is less of an issue if you've lost all of your armored vehicles and are now relying on foot infantry, but it's still an issue. So what we have is going to be a very critical set of maybe 2 to 3 months, end of January, February, March, maybe April, where you kind of have a window of winter campaigning. Um,
So I just want to get a clarification. Are you implying that Russia has lost most of its
Russia's lost a
military?
lot of
They've
vehicles.
lost a lot, but they have plenty more in storage, and they've been bringing them out of storage, and they've even completed new T-73B3 tanks. They're
I don't
bringing
think
in a lot of their T-90M tanks.
I don't think the
Um,
tank is going to be a big factor. I think what's going to be a
oh,
bigger factor
it's not
is
I agree
BMPs,
there. I agree.
BTRs.
Yeah, I agree with you, but
And those have been being lost at even more prodigious rate than tanks.
mhm.
The other thing I think that plays into this, and you sent me that report and I read it. I actually read a couple of reports you sent over the time, but I'm going to go back to that air report from the School of War that, or London,
It's
you know what?
it's yes.
So I kind of found that really interesting and kind of probably highlights why everything stands at a stalemate so often. Hi, Bubba. You're fine, dog. Uh, Kind of how it stands at a stalemate is Russia has this advantage in aircraft and interceptor aircraft, and they can counter Ukraine and dictate Ukraine's tactics if they want to try to make attacks. And at the same time, Ukraine can dictate their tactics. So this close air support and tactical air operations has kind of just been very tentative, according to that
Yeah,
report. That's obviously, I think, another factor to talk about. We should spend some time on is Russia's campaign of trying to blow up infrastructure.
critical infrastructure, and also that serves two purposes. I was actually just listening to this podcast with Dmitry Alperovich and Michael Kaufman. So I don't know if you've probably heard of Michael Kaufman. He's one of the
Yes.
um, analysts I follow. But essentially, this strategy has sort of two aims. One, to cripple the infrastructure, um, and it's actually less. They don't really give a. They don't really care per se about. They're not trying to turn Ukrainian public opinion against the war. There's nothing that they can do that would do that. And in fact, actually doing this makes it. It's worse for them. Um, but it undermines. It puts pressure on the West to help Ukraine restore its infrastructure, for them to provide Ukraine with additional air defense, missiles and systems that they're in short supply of themselves, and that is sort of one strategy too. So that's one part of it, to create pressure on the West, and two, um, to actually degrade Russia or Ukraine's air defense capabilities. So, to get them to waste a lot of their, anti-air missiles and things like this. Um, they they bought another batch of Shahed drones, which aren't extremely effective, in a military sense, but they're really, really cheap, and you can. I think that you can get close to accomplishing your goal of degrading Russia or Ukraine's air defense capability by swarming the cities with these drones. And it also, so this is another thing that both of the analysts brought up. It makes them, with their limited amount of air defense, have to make a difficult choice to pull air defense from the front line to defend cities, or to leave them there and let their cities take the brunt of this so that the troops may be protected. So I do think that that's one of the strategies that's of Russia currently in Ukraine, is to degrade their air defense capability, and to force them to make that choice. And that's why air defense is the most critical item right now for the West to supply Ukraine. It's the most critical issue.
So there are a couple. I don't disagree with any of that. There are a couple points, though, I think are very interesting. Is that these loitering munition drones, quote unquote kamikaze drones, do not really offer a military solution as is. They're not good at hitting moving targets, for example. We got a comment.
No.
Uh, BMP, P as in Peter, is the armored vehicle, remember, Kami. It is a infantry fighting vehicle that Russia has produced quite a few of, or more accurately, the Soviet Union. It is the backbone of how they move units. Um, so it's basically, it depends on what era you're talking about its production in and what model it is, but it's typically armed with something like a 20 millimeter cannon, and it has
I'm the 75 millimeter gun, I think, with
some of the
something
newer
close.
ones, yes, and it has
Yeah.
embarkation points for about a squad of infantry apiece, and they move these in concert to try, or the idea is they move them in concert with their tanks to try to provide infantry support as available. And then you also have a big vehicle with a heavy weapon. It's the same idea as United States Striker.
Or Bradley too, right?
Bradley's kind of a different beast entirely. The Bradley does a lot of things. That could be a topic in and of itself. I love the Bradley, but um,
I like them too. Yeah.
the
What's interesting is some of the newer Russian BTRs, the ones that they did not produce in large quantity, are theoretically, they're well armored, well protected. Just like Israel is sort of when they've built APCs, they've used the chassis of the Merkava tank as sort of an example. So and actually the Merkava tank itself is like a hybrid tank and armored personnel carrier. I think it can fit up to 10 soldiers.
my understanding is they kind of use it as a very heavily armored battlefield ambulance sometimes when they're not crushing Palestinians. Um, anyway, we're not going to get into that
We're gonna
either.
have
I'm going to
to
get
that out.
canceled. I'm going to get canceled.
Yeah,
Anyway,
we should have, maybe in the future we should have an episode on the Israel-Palestinian conflict. I think that that's such a complex issue and such a
we're definitely going to get canceled.
yeah. I don't want to. We already don't have any, you know,
Someone will come looking
monetized
specifically for that to cancel you.
to
That's
cancel it.
almost
Yeah,
guaranteed to get a viewership that you don't want. We'll
yeah,
talk
for
about
sure.
it, but we're going to prepare
Yeah,
a lot. Um,
for sure.
Getting back to the drones, though, the drones don't have much military utility. They have great utility if you want to blow up a transformer, though.
Oh,
Um,
of course.
and
And they have just the right amount of explosive on them to do that.
Yeah, it's not a lot
So
of explosives, like 20 kilograms. It's minuscule, but you could like put 12 of them on a target, shoot down 10 and two get through, and that's still enough damage to take up power to 5 city blocks.
yeah,
Like
um,
and I kind of get, because I spent 6 years working for an electric company. I kind of get the impetus behind how they're doing that. Um, but the thing that bugs me is that they're using a lot of high precision missiles, and they have some decent ones. Um, Outside of things like the S-300, they're using a lot of high precision missiles that they're not going to be able to replace that do have military utility in striking targets. And they're not going to have those when they turn around and try to, like, if they get to the end game of this plan, like you said, where they're trying to degrade Ukraine's air defense, they're going to be in a position where they're not going to have a lot of firepower to take advantage of that. And that kind of
yeah,
gets to my entire thing is Russia's plans seem incoherent. And you kind of pointed out that we don't necessarily know what Russia's plans are. We can only sort of project. But military science isn't exactly a field in which you can get a wide variety of opinions. And it's not like an options field. You kind of are
that's true. But
very,
there's
very
millions. There's literally maybe millions. Yeah, like I said, of different ways to screw up. So
so there was
I think that the
you took
Russian
Mr.
military,
Miller's
of
class on World War One, World War Two, right?
course, yeah,
You remember the book he had us read for that first World War One semester?
it's
James L.
Keegan's.
Stokesbury. We did Keegan for World War
Oh,
Two. At
so
least we did for us. I picked up the opposite one of each of that author eventually. But Stokesbury had a great line in Short History of World War One that I think, and it got reinforced to me when I started training as a cadet to this kind of concept. He said that a military operation is like a geometric proof, and that two commanders given the same set of knowns should come to the same set of conclusions. So my question is either Russia's totally off the wall, which isn't beyond
I
the realm of
think that
possibility at this
Stokesbury is
point.
wrong in that assumption, especially if you have military leaders that basically got their positions out of nepotism. So, you know,
But on a tactical
the Russian
level,
military hasn't fostered a lot of talent. Maybe that's a blanket statement, because I know that they have
it
pulled
might
off.
be. I
They
kind of
have
hesitate to put it too far out there of who
yeah,
is good and who isn't yet, because that
yeah.
kind of work doesn't really start until the guns go silent. Um,
That's true. That's true. And it has already started. Did you read the land warfare assessment from that same think tank that
I
I
am
mentioned?
halfway through that one. Um,
Yeah.
I have been, because I've been working on those video essays too, I have been very divided. And let's be honest, like I said, I sent you that one particular essay just to see get your goat. What if alt is just horrible? Um, but
Yeah.
uh, every time I try to watch one of those videos to put together the response, I just slowly lose my will to live. It's bad. It's particularly bad. At any rate,
We focus
go ahead.
efforts on this channel to go over, badly made amateurish assumptions. We would be doing this well past this war being over, assuming, God willing, that it'll be over.
We have at minimum six
You
to
know,
8 months.
yeah.
Um,
That would be great. That would be actually it would be much better if it was over tomorrow somehow. But I know that that's not going to happen.
well,
The
Russia
thing
has
that is,
been so incoherent that they might retreat and declare victory. It's entirely possible.
yeah, I know it is. But what's been very very alarming for me now is one it has showed me just how resilient Ukrainians are. I mean, I already knew it, but it's also very concerning for me as the winter gets colder. So many
That's
of my
fair.
friends are going without heat right now. Their electric might be working for 6 hours at best a day. So, they're really in dire straits. And the inevitable result of this is going to be another wave of refugees in the winter. I think that this is bound to happen. And that's another part of Russia's strategy, I think, is to, that's going to create pressure
There
on.
is someone who I want to talk to about that, and I'm going to have a conversation with her eventually. The aforementioned individual for whom the charity stream was last night, her mother, she's, like I said, in Poland, and she has some perspective on all that. Um,
That's awesome. I'd love to talk to her myself, honestly.
we'll see if she'll go for it. But
Yeah.
at any event, I think
I was myself considering doing that, but
being a
currently I have
refugee in
other.
Poland, I'm not sure that's necessarily a better deal for us at this point.
No, 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 to work to help refugees in Poland, but you know, yeah, I have other prospects at the moment, but um, in any case, actually, both of these prospects are related to working with refugees. So
Uh,
without going into detail,
I am going to short circuit the rest of this. I think we have covered most of what we wanted to cover anyway. And you want to go into
I
that
want to say
documentary
we didn't
about.
we didn't get to the documentary that much, but I want to just say something
Yeah, that's what I want to
because
finish out on.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay. So, yeah, how about the Ukrainian forces around Chernihiv? They did really, really well. Really, really proud of them,
They,
especially considering, they're people I know.
my uh,
Uh,
my
I'm
impression
really, really
is that they
proud
did
of,
fundamentals really well.
yeah.
So they fell back. They drew the Russians into uh, they drew the Russians into areas where they could kill them, and then just dropped artillery on them. And that's a very American plan. Uh,
It is, the one thing that, that I got too from the documentary was the siege of Chernihiv was almost unavoidable at that point. Because if they would have stayed to try to prevent a siege, they would have been out in the open, and that is area where Russian forces on that axis had they had a much, there was a huge disparity in firepower, and one favoring the Russians. So they used their artillery very well. And the one thing that is amazing is the artillery pieces that they were using were all you know, Soviet made pieces mostly.
Yeah, I don't necessarily outside of the shorter range. And
Yeah,
getting a shell dropped on you is going to be pretty deadly, regardless of what happens. And because Russia did not take the time to properly, Russia did horrible at the fundamentals. Russia didn't take the
yeah.
time to be able to set up things like counter battery, and they didn't do the things they needed to do. They did not leverage their equipment the way they're supposed to do it. So they get into these situations. They didn't maintain their equipment the way they're supposed to. They get in these situations where they think they're going to roll in. And I think you can't attribute all of it, but a good portion of Ukraine's initial success, I think, comes down to the fact that Russia did not tell the Russians what was going on. So they
Yeah,
rolled into a
100%.
country expecting minimal resistance, and they got absolutely smacked.
Yeah,
One of the things I think I had this deja vu feeling when you sent me the documentary and you sent some of the excerpts from it, and they were talking about Ukraine's decision to mobilize their officer cadets. And I remember having those conversations when I was an officer cadet about what would happen if things went very very poorly and uh, ROTC units were required to be mobilized. It was just a curiosity conversation we had amongst ourselves. But I kind of had this deja vu feeling of, oh God, those poor kids. But Kiev and Chernihiv worked out really well for Ukraine because Russia got themselves stuck in the mud, and then they got themselves stuck at bridges, and they got themselves stuck around cities, and they just stopped moving. And then their paratroopers getting beat up
those were the
was
best elements of that entire northern axis. By the way, I
kind
believe
of
they were.
hilarious, honestly. Uh,
It's hilarious because they employed them in such a way where they exposed them to artillery fire, to local, to they exposed them to Ukrainian forces that had tanks and
Well,
that
capturing an
outnumbered them.
airport and turning it into an air bridge is a great idea, assuming you have properly suppressed the enemies around the airport.
Yeah,
If you just try to
exactly.
drive people in, like, oh, there's this airplane trying to land on this runway full of enemy troops, we'll just shoot it down. Uh, okay, thank you, send another.
Very, very poorly executed plan. But the qualities of the northern Axis troops, they were mostly from the Central Military District. And I'm
Yes.
guessing you've read a little bit about the Central Military District, the reputation. It's a place that anyone anybody in Russia who, when they were used to have, I think, compulsory conscription, that's the place nobody wanted to go to because it's one of the poorest regions, and it's the region with the heaviest amount of dysfunction. Alcoholism is rampant there. I mean, as far as within the military itself, and that is where you see a lot of these atrocities too. Coming from these central military district units.
Yes, I'd also point
Um,
out that Russia had an inordinate amount of pride in the VDV. Like, have you seen the song?
the VoD, yeah,
Yes, I like.
everybody's seen that. Everybody's seen that
Oh,
recruitment video.
it
What's
just
interesting now is Ukraine has, there used to be the day of VoD, the holiday that they had as a sort of inherited Soviet tradition, and they've actually canceled it because they've been trying to sort of run like hell from everything Soviet, especially after this last, this since February 24th. And a lot of my acquaintances, the older ones, were maybe 10, 15 years younger than my parents, were veterans, Ukrainian veterans of the Soviet VDV, and some of them saw action in Afghanistan, and it's rather interesting. But that tradition, of paratroopers, like that love for them is present even in Ukraine. Ukraine's paratrooper units are some of their best.
Yeah, well, paratroopers are
Not
some of
sure
the
where
best of
you
any army.
are, but when you look at how they employed them, it's almost like did they want to get them destroyed? Were they just sending them to be, cut to pieces?
It
Because
was it was bad. It was they were also the vet to vet were also the unit that got stuck in the elevator in that one
yeah,
building really early in the war, and that is also hilarious to me. I could just see it now.
did they? Whatever happened?
The,
Does
I,
anyone ever
the
know
the
what
legend
happened
is
to
the Russians are still in the elevator. Uh,
they might have literally cannibalized themselves by now. That
anyway,
is something you can say.
Hetman needs to eat food, and I need to take out this dog before he goes nuts. So we're going to wrap
Okay.
this up. As for future stuff that we have planned, we don't have a very
Star Wars.
serious show coming up because A, keeping track of the war is long, B, the November show is canceled for technical difficulties, and because I couldn't come up with a more compelling thesis than KKK bad, actually. Um, and we have holidays, and I probably have to cook a massive dinner soon and organize all of that. So anyway, we're going to sometime in the next week do a show about Star Wars where we talk about how terrible boring Fett is, and a couple other topics.
Please
And
delete that.
this is a fight that we've been having since high school. Um,
Yeah, we literally have been having this fight, and it's not all going to be about Boba Fett. It's going to be just a huge talk about Star Wars, particularly recent. Well, particularly since the Disney takeover, and some of the better recent series. Is we're going to be talking about Andor a bit.
yes, I am finishing Andor as we speak. This is Avery, the top dog of history. Anyway, that
So
is
this
on
is
the
something
plate.
that we have a lot of expertise in is Star Wars.
Yes, we've been doing this for a
Yeah,
long
we will.
time. At any rate, January we are reconvening for a serious show where we talk about the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide. And we
And
have
that's
some,
something we have expertise in. I mean,
yes.
literal expertise.
So Hetman will be spending a great deal of time talking, and I'll be making snide remarks as usual. Uh, then should be also doing a show with an old friend who has worked in reproductive health and justice for well over a decade, and that will be sometime in January as well. And finally, January or December, I have to contact an artist about getting us some art, and we will be working on commissioning that. So we have stuff planned, so be sure to subscribe and stay tuned. And thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you, everyone.